Welcome to our video on self-perception. As we think about the concept of the self, a very important component that comes to mind is how we perceive ourselves or self-perception. So in this section, you're going to be learning about automatic and controlled processing and how these two different types of processing affect self-perception. You're also going to be learning about self-attributions and the key dimensions of attributions. You'll learn too about optimistic and pessimistic explanatory styles and how these are related to adjustment. And you'll learn about some motives that guide self-understanding and the methods that are used for self-enhancement. I think that as human beings, we tend to like to believe that our behavior and our thoughts about ourselves are primarily guided by our conscious thoughts and feelings. But what research suggests is that this is not the case, and that many of the behaviors that we engage in and our thoughts about ourselves and others are generated with very little consciousness and awareness. So here's an example. Let's say that you're having a conversation with a friend and it's very noisy, and then suddenly your attention, without any real effort, was maybe captured by other information, like someone pronouncing your name in the room, or maybe there was an important news story on TV. So this is an example of that automatic processing affecting your thinking and your behavior. You're not consciously paying attention to what's going on in the room or to what's happening on the news, but you're processing this at an unconscious level. So why does this happen? Well, our mind is characterized by two systems that process information from the environment. And these then two different systems affect how we think about ourselves. So the first is the controlled system, and the other is the automatic system, as you can see here on this slide. So let's first start with the automatic system or automatic processing. And so we can think of this as like a reflex of the mind, where processing of information is happening outside of our awareness, outside of consciousness. It's sort of a default mode. And as we think about how we think about ourselves and how we interpret information coming into us from conversations we're having with others, or even just a grade that we maybe get back on a test, that information is being filtered through these two different systems. And so this automatic processing system is a default mode. And this is the default mode is not allowing for or really using any deliberate decision making. So you might think of it as, when you drive to school in the morning, or when you get up and you brush your teeth, you're really not thinking much about your behavior. And then we have the controlled system or controlled processing. And this is a reflective structure where the processing of information, it's under the intentional and conscious control of the individual. So the automatic system is very important to smoothly interact with the environment. And what it does is it's allowing us to really efficiently execute our actions without having to spend time thinking about and planning every single step. So, let's say when you stand up from your chair in the classroom and you're getting ready to leave the class, and you get your book bag, you know exactly what to do to achieve a fully standing position. You're not thinking, how should I move my body? Most of us are not doing that. Where should I put my feet? We automatically know the situation and the proper process to reach that goal. But sometimes these automatic actions can have an effect on our ability to behave in a desired way or an appropriate way. And so there are times when we wish that our automatic behaviors or our automatic thinking about ourselves and others, we wish it would be different and more in line with our conscious and controlled intentions. So we can develop habits of thinking and habits of behaving. And we have to, if we want to change those, we have to be aware of those thoughts, aware of those behaviors, and move that intention into that realm of controlled processing. So think about this. Think about what you do or what you think about automatically. What are your default thoughts? Our automatic mind has a significant effect on the way we pay attention to and process the environmental information that we're getting from the world around us. And then this can affect how we perceive others, how we perceive ourselves, and how we then interact with other people. I think as we think about this type of processing, we can think about how we may actually have some biases as we interact with others. And we'll be looking at that as we move into the chapter on social thinking and social influence. But we can automatically process certain physical features, and on the basis of that information, we may form impressions and judgments about other people based on this automatic processing. And then what happens too is that we can do this with ourselves. So we may notice ourselves as we're walking by the mirror, and we notice something about ourselves, and then we have this default thought about ourselves, maybe positive or may not be very positive. Or maybe when we don't do so well on a test, we may have this automatic thought about our performance. So we're not really thinking through what we're experiencing. And as we do this, then this affects how it affects our outlook. It affects how we interact with other people. It affects our sense of self. And so controlled processing is what we need to do or would want to do if we want to adjust those automatic thoughts. This really can require quite a bit of effort. So if you're noticing that your default thoughts are to blame yourself, or maybe it's to blame others, or maybe your default thought is to find excuses for your behavior, or maybe it's to find excuses for other people's behavior. If you want to change that, then you have to really develop a new habit where you regularly question or you regularly remind yourself of that controlled thought, that new thought that you want to have. And at first it will be very conscious and it will feel unnatural, but then it too can become automatic, just like the other thoughts that you had before. Self-perception is affected by the inferences that we draw about our own behavior. These inferences are called self-attributions. Self-attribution refers to the process by which we determine the antecedents and consequences of our behaviors. Antecedents are those things that happen before behaviors occur. As we evaluate our own behavior and the consequences, we infer from the observations that we make about ourselves. We infer things like what's going on in the environment and what are our attitudes, what are our beliefs, and what are the emotions. And we then also look at the situational context. So what's going on around us as a particular behavior occurs. So here's exactly how this happens. So individuals observe their own overt behavior, and then they assign intentionality through an attribution to either internal or external causes. And then they infer their own internal states from their behavioral observations. So let's say, for example, you are in a course and you enjoy reading about the topic, and even read when you're not studying for an exam. So you can make then internal attributions of causality. So you probably could infer from your behavior, since you're reading and it's not necessarily necessary at that point in time, you're just interested in the topic, you can infer that you hold favorable attitudes towards that particular subject. The problem, though, is that we're not always great at making these self-attributions. And so sometimes what might happen is we make errors, and a very common error is known as the self-serving bias. And this particular bias suggests that people tend to attribute positive outcomes to internal factors, internal things about themselves, and negative outcomes to external causes. So if you'll remember, at the beginning of this module, I had this myth or reality question where I asked you to what degree you agree with a particular statement. And the statement was that People are eagerly willing, basically, I'm paraphrasing, to accept both their failures and their successes. But the problem is that we may think that we are, but actually we don't tend to be great at doing this. We're really good at accepting responsibility for our successes, but generally we're not so great at accepting responsibility for our failures. Now, of course, from time to time, we do this, right? And we might blame ourselves. We might say things like, I should have tried better, and maybe we should have tried better. But more often than not, we do tend to, especially if we look at everyone across the board, and we were taking an average, sort of average measure of the frequency by which people accept responsibility for their failures, we would find that people aren't very great at doing this. The interesting thing, though, is that we tend to think that we don't do that. We don't want to see ourselves in that way. We think only other people don't accept responsibility for failures. But actually, we all are vulnerable to doing this. And so I think if we're aware of this, this can be helpful. But it also can be helpful if we want to better understand the behavior of other people. So here's an example. Let's say that you have a class of several of your classmates, let's say, take a test, and some of the students get a really good grade. Maybe they get an A. Well, this theory, this self-attribution theory that encompasses self-serving bias. Remember, self-serving bias is where you're taking responsibility for your successes, but not for your failures. So the people who get an A, what are they going to say? Are they going to say, oh, it was something about the class? Or are they going to, more often than not, look at themselves? Well, with self-serving bias, they're going to look at themselves. They're likely to attribute their good grade to their own abilities. And then in contrast, for people who perhaps didn't do so well, they're less likely to attribute the poor grade to the difficulty. They're less likely to attribute the poor grade to something about themselves, and they are more likely to attribute the grade to the difficulty of the assignment or maybe the harshness of the professor. Now, we'll talk about some other things that we might do that would be still not assigning our own responsibility, but may not be directly in line with blaming these external factors. We'll talk about a few of these different strategies that we use. But what we're doing ultimately is we're wanting to accept responsibility for successes, but not for our failures. And this goes back to wanting to maintain a consistent view of ourselves. And I think I would encourage you, if you happen to maybe get into a disagreement with someone, you're disagreeing about something. Let's imagine that you have a friend who hurts your feelings and you tell them that they really hurt your feelings. And for a friend who likes to see themselves as a kind person, someone who doesn't tend to hurt others' feelings, what do you think they're going to do? Are they going to accept responsibility for that, or are they likely to blame external factors? Well, if their view of themselves, especially if their self-concept, remember that self-concept is so fundamental to who we are, is that they are kind and thoughtful of other people, they're probably going to look for external factors. They might do things like say, well, I was really tired, or, well, I was having a bad day, or you're too sensitive. And they may not say that, but they may be thinking those things, and they might even say it so that they can maintain that consistent sense of self. And I'd encourage you to notice yourself as you're doing that. If we do this a lot and we're not cognizant of it, so let's imagine that this friend likes to see themselves as very kind and thoughtful, but they do things that aren't so kind and thoughtful, and they're often blaming that on external factors. Are they really going to grow as a person in that area of being kind and thoughtful? They're not. And one of the reasons people feel so motivated to maintain that consistent self is, if you'll remember, you learned earlier about how anxiety provoking it can be when we have a discrepancy between how we see ourselves and how we think we ought to be. So this can contribute to this overall sense of discomfort and that motivation then to focus on our internal factors that have contributed to the good things about ourselves, to our successes, and the external forces that don't have anything to do with us that are explaining our shortcomings or our failures. Sometimes these errors in self-attribution can be responsible for poor psychological health. So, for example, when we think about depression, depression can often be seen as a function of a maladaptive style of self-attribution that's opposite of the self-serving bias. So sometimes people will, especially depressed people, may attribute positive outcomes to external causes, but negative outcomes to internal causes. So this is still not rational. And as a result, then depressed people view positive outcomes as a result of the chance of, let's say, fate or something else outside of themselves that made that good thing happen rather than seeing that within themselves. And then they may be inclined then to feel personally responsible for negative outcomes. And this is a chart from your textbook that compares internal and external attributions. So just keep in mind, internal are exactly what that phrase says. Internal attributions are qualities within us that are linked to a person and their actions and the outcomes. So we could think, for example, of things like age and gender and skills, ethnicity, personality factors, intelligence. So when we explain why certain things have happened, why we've done something, or why we had a particular outcome, if we're assigning it to variables within ourselves, that's an internal attribution. And then external attributions are those things that are outside of ourselves. So those will be things like the setting, maybe the classroom. The classroom was noisy. The classroom lighting was too bright. Or maybe at the concert hall, there were people who were very disruptive. That's why I was so irritable. Maybe you were, let's say you did something when you were at this particular concert hall or at a play, and let's look at rules and guiding behavior. And maybe you did something you shouldn't have, and you say, well, I didn't know that those were the rules. There are no rules that state we're supposed to do this. Or weather, time of day, environment. So we're looking at those factors that are outside of ourselves. As we look at our behaviors and the events that happen in our lives, our self-perception is affected by whether we perceive the behavior in ourselves as being stable or unstable. In other words, this automatic way of thinking, so this is not a controlled type of processing. We're really not making conscious choices about this. This is automatic default type of thinking. And we ask ourselves, is the situation changing across time, or is it permanent? So this is the degree to which we attribute outcome causality to temporary or temporarily fixed factors. Now, what's interesting is that research suggests that this can affect our motivation. And as I'm imagining you could see, if you think that you tend to not do very well when you take tests, and that's a stable attribution, are you going to be very motivated to study or to even try hard when you take a test? You might be less motivated. You might be somewhat motivated, but you're probably not going to be as motivated as you would be if you thought of those behavioral outcomes or those outcomes in your life. Your test grades, for example, were due to unstable factors, things that were outside of outside of that fixed realm, things that are variable and subject to change. So we could say then a stable attribution happens when we believe an outcome will persist indefinitely. And then an unstable attribution happens when an outcome is attributed to a transient factor. In other words, it's specific to a period of time. Now, I think it's interesting to note that people who are pessimistic tend to believe that the causes of negative life events tend to be, what do you think, permanently or subject to change? Are they permanent factors or factors that are subject to change? Well, they tend to view negative life events as permanently fixed factors, whereas optimists tend to believe that setbacks happen because of temporary factors. So in terms of positive outcomes, an individual who has a tendency towards an optimistic explanatory style is more likely to attribute a positive outcome to a permanent factor, while a pessimistic explanatory style would view that positive outcome as the result of kind of a transient factor, something like, this is a fluke, or this doesn't tend to happen very often. And I think as I'm sharing this with you, it makes a lot of sense. Hindsight, of course, in psychology is often 2020. That's why often a lot of people think that, as they, you might have friends or family that you're taking a psychology course, and they may feel that psychology is common sense, or that they already know these types of things. But everything in hindsight, often, or many things, can be common sense. I could tell you the opposite of many of the theories and concepts that you're learning about in this book, or you could tell your friends and family that, and they'd probably say, "Oh, that's common sense." But so what we I think of as common sense is something that we're maybe taking for granted. If we learn this and we say, well, that's common sense, we're probably taking that for granted, that this actually is based on research, and that if we were to flip this idea around, it might also sound like common sense. So it is important for us to know the research, know the theories, as all of you know as students in psychology. And I think as you understand these concepts of attribution, it can help you to understand the behaviors of other people and your own behaviors, what you do to sort of keep that or maintain that consistent sense of self, to maintain that self-concept. We all are very driven to do this. Remember that. And we do all kinds of things to maintain that identity. It doesn't feel good when we are moving outside of how we think we should be or how we would like to be. So a very well-known researcher in this field is Weiner, and you can see there's an article cited here from 1972, and Weiner and his fellow researchers, Fries and Kukla and Reed and Rosenbaum, they were studying the perception of the causes of success and failure. And you can see that this was an article from 1972, and it's cited in your textbook because because it contributed to a well-known model that's called Werners Model. And it basically assumes that people's explanations for success and failure emphasize internal versus external causes and stable versus unstable causes. So we're putting here together what you've just learned about both internal attributions, external attributions, and then unstable and stable causes of behavior, how we attribute those outcomes or those behaviors. And so for example, if you attribute an outcome to great effort or to lack of effort, you're citing causes that lie within the person or within yourself. And since effort can vary over time, the causal factors at work are unstable. And there are some other examples of causal factors that fit into each of the four cells that you see here in this image on this slide here. And then another factor that contributes to our self-perception is whether we view things as being controllable or uncontrollable. So are we viewing our behaviors or the outcomes of what has happened as within our control or outside of our control? And so this is just simply considering whether or not we have any control over the behavior. So that's another important factor that affects self-perception. And it contributes to how we see ourselves because we ask ourselves that question, or we might even explain to others and say, well, it was outside of my control. I didn't have any control over that. Or it was within my control. And that can create anxiety, especially if the outcome is not aligned with how we like to see ourselves. And so it might then compel us to change our perception of whether the event was controllable or uncontrollable. So we each have tendencies to use similar causal attributions for many different types of events in our life. And we may have a tendency to be optimistic in our explanatory style or pessimistic in our explanatory style. So people who use an optimistic explanatory style, and I wonder if as you're listening to this might be you, do you see setbacks as being external? In other words, outside of yourself, unstable. In other words, that can change. So you can pick your feet back up and try again. There can be a different outcome. Or are you someone who is pessimistic and in their explanatory style. In other words, you see setbacks as being internal, something about you, and is it something that is unchanging? So I always tend to do poorly on tests. I always tend to mess up relationships. And is it a global factor? And I should have mentioned that a moment ago. When we think about optimism, specific means, is it something that's specific to the situation? It's not something that's universally true about me. It doesn't apply to lots of different situations. It's something that's very narrowly defined within me. And then a global factor will be something that's just all encompassing. I just tend to mess up everything. Whereas, I do tend to have some trouble sometimes with, maybe you're in a relationship with someone and maybe you have a hard time resolving conflict. So it's much more specific than global. Like, I don't do well in relationships. So very different approach. So which one of these do you think you are? And what do you think you can do to, if you are more pessimistic in your explanatory style, what might be one step that you could take to move towards optimism? Could you begin to challenge those thoughts of internal attributions when you are failing at something, and start to remind yourself to focus on as well potential external factors? And this requires conscious processing. We have often default ways of thinking. And if our default way of thinking is to look at ourselves as being the reason for failing, then we have to remind ourselves that there are external factors, and this can take effort, a lot of investment and effort. Think about yourself. Let's say you're 20 years old, 22, 25 years old, 18, whatever your age is, or maybe you're 30, 40, 50 years old. Think about how many years you've been thinking in this way and how your brain is wired to think in this way. And so you want to create new pathways so that you can see setbacks as not only explained by potentially things within you, because sometimes they are due to things within you, but that they also can be due to things outside of yourself. And then imagine how that could change your motivation. How could that affect your mental health? So you have to remind yourself. And reminding yourself could be by even something as simple as having a rubber band around your wrist and having a habit that you tell yourself at the beginning of the day, anytime that I say that if something happens that's bad, and I say it's due to something within me, I need to pluck that rubber band, and that will be a reminder that I need to think about external factors. And you might even want to tell other people in your life about this pattern that you tend to have and ask them to help you. Maybe your significant other, your mother, your father, your brother, your sister, whoever it might be, and ask them to remind you to challenge that way of thinking. Remember, making our goals public can be very helpful if we want to change how we are, if we want to make those improvements in our lives, going back to behavior modification. Another method of self-enhancement is basking in self-reflected glory. This is where we try to enhance our image by publicly announcing our association with those who are successful. And this might include, for example, if we are fans of a particular sports team, when they win, we might say things like, "We won." Or if we know someone who is famous or very successful, we might like other people to know this. So we might say something like, "My friend who is such and such actor in Hollywood," or it might be, "My friend who owns such and such company." So these are things that we do, again, to enhance our sense of self. Something else that we do to enhance our sense of self is self-handicapping. This might sound like a very strange thing to do, but this is where we sabotage our own performance to provide an excuse for a possible failure. So for example, let's imagine that you have a test coming up, and instead of studying for the test, you go out with your friends and you don't study. This way, if you don't do well on the test, you're not looking at yourself and saying, "I'm not very good at this subject." Instead, you look at situational factors like, "Well, I didn't study," or "I went out with my friends last night," and that's likely to make you feel better about yourself. Another way that we try to enhance our sense of self is through something called basking in self-reflected glory. And so this is when we use occasions when our social groups are successful in meeting their goals to fuel our own self-worth. And so as we do this, We are using and then advertising our own in-groups positive achievements to boost our self-esteem. We also can do this with people who perhaps we're not closely connected to. We might like to connect ourselves, for example, to sports teams. So we don't have a connection with sports teams. Generally, most of us don't. We don't know the people on the team. We may not have gone to the school where the team plays. But yet you find people who are so connected to sports teams that you sense that it becomes a very important part of their identity. And I think this is especially true, and we see this being especially true when those teams are successful. We also might do this, as I said, with our own in-groups. So perhaps we have a friend who does something that's very good, very kind, and we like to see ourselves as kind. So we might advertise to others the thing that our friend did. Or perhaps we have a friend who is really smart and just got a scholarship, and we like to see ourselves in that way too. And so we let others know about our friend's success. And we're not just doing this because we're proud of our friend, but as we're doing this, we may be doing it to enhance our own self-image. So let me give you an example of a study that investigated this very concept of basking in self-reflected glory. So what researchers did is they observed the clothes and clothing accessories that students at different US universities were wearing to class on Mondays. And what they found that was when the university's football team had won its game on a Saturday, students were likely to emphasize their university membership by wearing clothing like sweatshirts and hats and symbols of the university on them. But they were significantly less likely to wear university clothing on Mondays that followed the football loss. And then furthermore, there was a study at a university where participants or students were asked to describe a victory by their university's team. And when they did this, they would frequently use the term we, whereas when asked to describe a game where their school lost, they used the term we significantly less frequently. And so when their team was successful, they might say things like, we're a good school or we beat them. And this is providing some type of social identity for these students. It's helping them to feel good about themselves. What it's doing is it is enhancing their self-image. Another strategy that we might use to enhance our sense of self is self-handicapping. So have you ever found yourself walking into an exam knowing that you studied less than you should have, or maybe that you went out with friends pre-COVID instead of studying the night before the test? Or have you ever begun maybe a competition for those of you who were athletes in school, or perhaps there was some other type of competition where maybe you knew you didn't prepare enough? And in any of these situations, what were you thinking? How were you feeling? And were you saying things to yourself or doing things that somehow ended up enhancing your sense of self? And were you even aware of yourself doing this? Well, self-handicapping is a cognitive strategy where people will make advanced external attributions for an anticipated failure or a poor performance in an event that's upcoming. So, for example, let's say that you go into the exam and you know that you didn't study as much as you should have. So in advance, you're letting other people know, hey, I didn't really study that much, or hey, I went out with friends the night before. Or maybe as you're going to this competition, maybe you play tennis or you play soccer or whatever, and you didn't prepare enough. You really haven't been practicing. And so before the game, before the match, you let other people know. So you're letting other people know that there are external attributions. There are things outside of yourself. Or, hey, my mom was, needed me to help with something. Or, my grandmother was calling me, asked me to come over to make dinner for her. So there's attributions that we're making that are explaining away why we are not successful. And as we do this, then it allows us to maintain our sense of self. Remember that that statement at the beginning of this module. It was that myth or reality statement where you were asked to consider whether or not we try to maintain a consistent sense of self. And we definitely do. And this is just one example of doing this. So you don't want to look at yourself as the explanation that you aren't a good student, that you don't really know the material well, but that it's something outside of yourself. You know, maybe you didn't get to study because of your roommate being loud, or whatever it is. There's something outside of yourself that is explaining why you're not successful, because you are a successful, smart student. That's how you see yourself. And it's uncomfortable to think of ourselves in ways outside of how we consistently tend to see ourselves. Some of us may tend to use the strategy of self-handicapping more than others. So here are some items that you may agree with, and the more of these you agree with, the more often you're likely using self-handicapping. So how about this one? When I do something wrong, my first impulse is to blame circumstances, or I tend to put things off until the last moment. Procrastination is thought to be a big self-handicapping strategy. That way, if you don't do so well, it's not because you're not smart or you're not a good student, it's because you waited until the last minute. So you didn't have enough time. Here's another. I suppose I feel under the weather more often than most people do. So sometimes using sickness or illness could be a self-handicapping strategy, or saying I'm easily distracted by noises or my own creative thoughts when I try to read. I would do a lot better if I tried harder. So I really didn't try. So that's why I didn't do well. So I want to let other people know this. It's one thing to think this, it's another to let other people know. Now, these might be really true statements about you, but if we tend to use these often, perhaps we are using those external attributions to explain our behavior because we want to maintain that consistent sense of self. Here's another one. I sometimes like being mildly ill for a day or two because it takes off the pressure. So these are just a few, and so I'd encourage you to think about your own attributions that you make, those external attributions you make as you attempt to explain your behaviors, where maybe you're not, you're sort of preparing yourself, but you're really preparing others so that they know why you're not doing as well as you normally would. Let's take a look at self-monitoring. This is the capacity to observe or measure and evaluate our own behavior, and it's an important component of what's called executive functioning. So you'll see this concept later in the text, the concept of executive functioning, and some of you have heard this concept before. It's very important in psychology and our understanding of human development. It's a part of cognitive processing that includes our ability to connect past knowledge with present experience in a way that allows us to plan, to organize, to strategize, to pay attention to details, and to manage time. So you can imagine then, when we think about self-monitoring, the degree to which we attend to and control the impressions we make on others, how that's related to executive functioning. So let's think about then how self-monitoring may develop over time and throughout the lifespan. If we think about small children, they don't typically have the ability to self-monitor. It develops over time. So let's think about a toddler who doesn't have the capacity to monitor their expressive behaviors. She's going to let her mom know when she's unhappy with, for example, snack choice. She's going to have a lot of tears and screams of dissatisfaction, and that's what she knows to do. And monitoring her own behavior and how it affects others is not part of her skill set. On the other hand, we have her mom. And when her mom is presented with a food choice that she doesn't like, she might choose not to eat it or ask for something different or eat it in a way that is respectful to the person who gave it to her. Screaming and crying are not typically part of her mom's response because she has the ability to monitor her own behavioral expression. She can understand and then internalize how the behavioral expectations of others are important if we want to have positive relationships with them. Now, although we tend to develop self-monitoring as we grow throughout the lifespan, still some people are higher in self-monitoring than others. Some are more concerned with making favorable impressions than others, who might be less likely to express their true feelings or attitudes.
Some of you may just feel like you have a natural inclination to regulate yourself and to be able to monitor how you behave. But a lot of this is learning. While our brains are primed and ready to develop an ability to do this, much of this has to do with what we've learned growing up and what we've learned we ought to do or should do, what we saw our parents doing. We also can think about how some specific learning in adulthood can play a role in our ability to monitor our behavior. So we might read books about this. We might be very concerned, we might read books about body language and how our own body language affects others. And perhaps prior to reading this book, we might not have been very aware. And then once we read the book, we're aware, and then we engage in those behaviors that might affect how others perceive us. Lastly, I'd like for you to take a look in your textbook at application 6.6, Building Self-Esteem. And in this section, you're going to see some suggestions for improving your own self-esteem. While this is only a brief section of your textbook, it's a really good starting place for you to start thinking about how you can improve your own self-image in healthy ways. Please remember also that as you're reviewing this chapter, to have read the chapter and responded to the reflective learning questions that are on D2L. Please also be sure to have watched the videos that are there as well, and let me know what questions you have. Thank you.
So what have you learned about? Well, you've learned about the differences between automatic and controlled processing and how we have default ways of thinking, and that we need to remember that we have default ways of thinking. I know that sounds obvious, but if we remind ourselves that often these patterns we have, especially if they are leading to negative feelings, reducing motivation, reminding ourselves that these are often due to automatic ways of thinking, default ways of thinking, and that we need to move into that controlled processing realm if we want to change that way of thinking. And eventually that controlled processing will become default ways of thinking. It will become automatic ways of thinking, an automatic way of thinking. You also learned about self-attributions and the key dimensions of attributions. And then you learned too about optimism and pessimism and the optimistic and pessimistic explanatory style specifically, and how that's related to adjustment. And you also learned about the different motives that guide our self-understanding and the methods that we use for self-enhancement. What will you learn next? You're going to be learning about self-regulation and why it is so important. You'll also learn about the ego depletion model of self-regulation. You'll learn about self-efficacy and how it develops and why it is so important to psychological adjustment. You'll learn as well about self-defeating behaviors and some of the reasons for why we engage in these behaviors. I look forward to seeing each of you online. And in the meantime, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to let me know.